I remember that day so vividly that it feels as if time itself decided to freeze just for me, allowing every second, every detail, every heartbeat to etch itself into my memory forever. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky with muted shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows that stretched across the driveway like fingers reaching toward me, almost as if they were trying to hold me back, to warn me of what was coming. I was sitting in the car, wedged between familiar faces I had loved fiercely for years, faces I had cherished, nurtured, and in many ways defined my life around. My son, whose small hands I once held to steady his first steps, whose laughter filled rooms with music, whose presence had once been the center of my world. His wife, who I had welcomed with open arms, believing love could always find a place in a family if hearts were open. And the children, my grandchildren, whose tiny bodies I had once cradled and comforted through the long nights, whose innocent giggles had once been the melody of my days. And yet, despite the familiarity of their faces, there was a coldness in the car, a distance that seemed to hum in the air, palpable and almost suffocating, like fog rolling in over a field, thick and heavy, that no amount of warmth or light could ever seem to penetrate. My daughter-in-law looked at me with eyes I could no longer read, eyes that once seemed warm and welcoming, but now reflected a barrier I could not cross. Her expression was hard, careful, measured, and when she spoke, the words landed like stones thrown into the fragile pond of my heart, sending ripples of disbelief that I could feel in my chest and down to the tips of my fingers. "Maybe it's better if you leave. Just leave," she said, as though speaking the truth of some undeniable reality, yet without a single tremor in her voice to betray any remorse, any hesitation, any hint that she might understand the magnitude of what she was asking. The words struck me with a quiet force that left the world around me still, suspended in a strange, almost surreal silence, as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to respond, for me to shatter under the weight of those simple yet devastating syllables. My heart thumped in a rhythm entirely foreign to me, erratic yet steady, pounding against my chest as though trying to escape the cage of my ribs. And yet, strangely, no tears came, no cries escaped my lips, no shouts or protests arose. Instead, I found myself offering a smile, a small, fragile smile that I barely recognized, one that belied the storm of emotions raging inside, the swirl of hurt, disbelief, sorrow, and a deep, aching sense of betrayal that threatened to consume me entirely. That smile, though slight, carried a weight of understanding I had never known before. It was not the smile of someone who had accepted defeat, nor was it a concession to resignation. It was the smile of someone standing at the edge of a precipice, seeing the vast chasm ahead, and yet acknowledging with quiet dignity that stepping forward, leaving behind everything I had ever known, was inevitable. In that instant, I realized the enormity of what lay ahead. One movement, the simple act of opening the car door and setting my feet on the gravel driveway, would become a symbolic and irrevocable point of no return. It was as though life had compressed all the pain, love, disappointment, and longing of decades into that single moment, asking me to choose between clinging to a past that no longer existed or embracing the terrifying uncertainty of a future I would now have to navigate alone. And so I moved. My hand reached for the handle with deliberate calm, and I felt the metal cold against my skin, grounding me even as my mind swirled with memories of laughter-filled dinners, of birthday parties and school recitals, of bedtime stories and gentle scoldings, all the small, precious moments that had once knit our lives together into something I thought would last forever. As I opened the door, the car seemed to sigh behind me, the click of the latch sounding impossibly loud in the heavy, thick silence of that evening. The engine hummed faintly, the voices inside fading into nothing more than distant echoes, voices that had once been my anchors in life now receding into a reality from which I could no longer claim belonging. And as I stepped out, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my feet, the cool evening air brushing against my skin, I understood with absolute clarity that I would never ride with them again, that the warmth and comfort I had known in that car were gone, and that the world I had taken for granted, the one in which I had thought my place secure, had shifted in ways I could not undo. For a long moment, I simply stood there, inhaling the quiet, feeling the gravity of my choice settling around me. The horizon before me stretched in the fading light, a world both beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. I let the wind touch my face, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers from the garden my grandchildren had once trampled joyfully. The scent mingled with the fatting heat of the day, and I felt tears prick at the edges of my eyes, not from sorrow alone, but from the strange, liberating weight of realizing that I was still standing, still breathing, still capable of walking forward, even if it meant walking alone. And in that moment, as the car receded further into the distance, as the laughter and chatter that once filled the space behind me dissolved into memory, I felt a strange, unspoken affirmation rise within me, a quiet but unwavering truth that life, though altered, would continue, that love, though fractured, would endure in new ways, and that I, though separated from those I had cherished most, would still find my way, step by step, into a future that was mine to claim, even if it was no longer shared with them. I grew up with the unwavering belief that family was the most sacred, unshakable pillar in life, the invisible thread that held the world together no matter what storms came, the quiet certainty that no matter how far I roamed or how many mistakes I made, there would always be someone waiting with open arms, with patience, with understanding, with that kind of love that never asks for anything in return. I remember the mornings of my childhood, the soft golden light spilling through lace curtains, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen, the gentle hum of conversation between my parents as they sipped their tea, the laughter bouncing off walls and filling the rooms with a warmth I could wrap myself in like a soft blanket. That sense of belonging became my first definition of love, my blueprint for life, and I carried it with me like a treasured secret into adulthood. When my son was born, that belief took on a life of its own, multiplied 100-fold, until my heart felt as though it could burst from the intensity of love I held for him. I remember cradling him in my arms for the first time, marveling at the perfection of his tiny fingers, the way his eyelids fluttered as he dreamed, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the scent of baby skin that seemed to carry with it all the hopes and dreams I had ever had. I whispered promises into his ear that no one could hear but us, vows that I would always protect him, guide him, and love him unconditionally, that nothing in this world could ever shake my devotion, that I would be his refuge and his safe place, his unmovable constant in a life I knew would one day test him in ways I could not yet imagine. Our home, though never lavish, was always rich with love. There were evenings when we would sit together around the dinner table, the clatter of cutlery mixing with our voices as we shared stories about our day, laughed at each other's mistakes, and dreamed aloud about the future. We were not affluent, but we had enough: a roof over our heads, food on the table, laughter in the walls, and hearts full of hope. There was a rhythm to our days that carried a comforting predictability, a sense that no matter what challenges came, we had each other to weather them. And when my son grew older, that rhythm included the story of his first love, the excitement in his voice, the shy glances across a classroom, the nervous anticipation as he introduced her to me, the young woman who would become my daughter-in-law. I welcomed her into our lives with open arms, truly believing that the love she shared with my son could be a bridge that would strengthen our family rather than divide it. I told myself, perhaps naively, that love should always be met with openness, that trust and kindness could turn even the smallest gestures into the foundation of a lifelong bond. At first, she seemed to fit seamlessly into our world. She laughed at our jokes, offered a helping hand with the children, smiled in a way that felt warm and sincere, and participated in family traditions with a willingness that made me feel hopeful, even proud, that my son had chosen well. I imagined years stretching ahead of us like a golden path, our family growing closer, celebrating birthdays and weddings, sharing quiet Sunday afternoons, holding hands in moments of grief and joy alike, creating memories that would anchor us in ways we could never imagine losing. But life has a way of testing even the strongest bonds, and I would come to realize, in the most painful and subtle ways, that nothing in this world is guaranteed, not even love, not even family. Sometimes the cracks form so slowly, so imperceptibly, that you don't even notice them until they have grown wide enough to threaten the foundation of your entire world. I remember the first time I sensed something shifting, the faint, almost imperceptible change that made my heart tighten with unease. The way she began to avoid direct eye contact with me, the slight hesitation in my son's voice when he spoke, as though he were carefully measuring every word before committing it to air, the small, almost imperceptible pauses in conversation that left silences heavier than the words themselves. There were moments, fleeting yet undeniable, when I felt the subtle exclusion in shared jokes, the invisible line that had been drawn without announcement, and though I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that love always comes with challenges and misunderstandings. A quiet, persistent voice inside me whispered differently, insistently, a gentle but firm warning that something wasn't right. That small whisper grew louder with each passing day, nudging me to pay attention, to see the reality behind the smiles, the polite words, the laughter that no longer reached the eyes, to acknowledge that the family I had believed in so deeply, the sanctuary I had trusted and invested my entire heart into, was no longer the safe, unshakable haven it once had been. And in that realization, a slow ache began in my chest, a heaviness that accompanied me even in the brightest of days, a melancholy that tinged every moment with a subtle, inescapable awareness that love, even when it once seemed eternal, is fragile, and that sometimes, even those we hold closest to our hearts can become distant, unfamiliar, and painfully out of reach, leaving us with the quiet, aching question of what it truly means to belong. It started with small, almost imperceptible things at first, like the first drizzle of rain on an otherwise clear day, subtle enough to ignore at first but persistent enough to slowly soak through and leave a lingering chill. Conversations that had once flowed effortlessly, punctuated with laughter and shared stories, now carried a strain that was almost tangible, like a taut rope stretched too tightly, ready to snap at the slightest tug. When I suggested family outings, whether it was a simple walk in the park or a trip to the countryside, I would be met with polite nods, murmured agreements that lacked the warmth and enthusiasm that had once made my heart swell with joy, that had once made me feel like I truly belonged. My presence, which had once been welcomed with hugs, smiles, and an almost unspoken appreciation, began to feel tolerated, acknowledged with civility but void of the affection I had grown accustomed to over the years. I remember the first argument that didn't even feel like an argument, but hit me harder than any raised voice could. I had bought a small toy for my grandson, something I had chosen with care, imagining the delight on his face as he discovered it, only to hear my daughter-in-law insist he could not have it, her words sharp and final, cutting through the warmth of the room like a sudden gust of cold wind. When I questioned her, my voice trembling with confusion and hurt, she looked at me with a precision I had never seen before, a gaze that seemed to measure every inch of my presence and then dismiss it. "This is my house, my rules," she said, and in that moment I felt as though I had been cast out, like a stranger who had wandered into a world where I no longer belonged, where the familiarity I had trusted for so long had become foreign and hostile. The pang of hurt that shot through me was unlike anything I could name. It was sharp and bitter, mingled with disbelief, and a deep, aching sorrow that made my chest feel impossibly heavy. My son remained silent throughout, his eyes flicking between us like he was trapped in some internal storm, torn between loyalty and fear, and yet he said nothing. He didn't defend me, he didn't explain, he did not even attempt to soothe the tension that now hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. He just watched, and in his silence, I felt 1,000 tiny fractures spreading through the foundation of the family I had cherished, a silent testament to the widening gap I could not bridge no matter how deeply I loved them. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice other subtle, almost imperceptible signs, each one a quiet blow to the sense of security I had carried for decades. Whispered conversations would halt as I entered the room, leaving a faint, uncomfortable pause that made me acutely aware of my own heartbeat, of my own place in a home that no longer felt entirely mine. Offers to help with chores or with the children would be met with sighs, dismissive gestures, or abrupt changes in topic, as though my care and attention were nuisances rather than expressions of love. The smiles I once took for granted, the laughter I had believed to be eternal, now felt calculated, distant, and rarely met my eyes in the way that once made me feel seen, truly seen. The foundation of our family, which I had trusted with unwavering faith for decades, seemed to crumble quietly beneath me, leaving me unmoored, unsure of where I belonged, and uncertain of how to navigate a home that now felt foreign and fragile. And yet, despite the growing tension, despite the subtle betrayals and the cold silences, I stayed. I stayed because love is not something easily abandoned, especially when it is intertwined with years of memories, with the care and nurturing of a life, with a history that cannot simply be erased. I stayed because I believed, stubbornly, that love could withstand anything, that patience, understanding, and gentle persistence could heal even the deepest divides, that a bond forged through decades of shared life could survive discomfort, misunderstanding, and distance. But the cracks continued to spread, slow and insidious, stretching wider with every unspoken word, every dismissive glance, every sigh that carried more weight than any confrontation could. And with each passing day, I felt myself shrinking, feeling smaller in the spaces I had once occupied with confidence and joy, becoming less certain of my own worth and place, like a shadow lingering quietly at the edges of a life I had once helped build, watching from a distance as the warmth I had known began to fade, leaving only a cold, quiet tension in its place, a tension I could neither ignore nor easily mend, no matter how deeply I wished I could. I'll never forget that day, the way it unfolded with a quiet, almost deceptive calm, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash itself. And yet at the time, I had no inkling of what was to come, no warning that the life I had built, the family I had nurtured, the home that had once been filled with warmth and laughter, would be shaken to its very core in a single, irreversible moment. It started like any other day, with the soft, comforting sounds of my grandchildren laughing, their voices light and musical, carrying across the rooms like birdsong in the early morning, and with my son moving carefully between us, attempting to maintain peace, his words calm, measured, as though he were walking on a tightrope, afraid that any misstep might bring the fragile balance crashing down. I, for my part, moved quietly about the kitchen, preparing tea as I had done countless times before, the familiar clink of teacups and the warm aroma of brewing leaves providing a small anchor, a semblance of normalcy in a house that had begun to feel strangely unmoored. Though at the time, I did not yet fully grasp the depth of the upheaval that was about to arrive. Yet even in that seemingly ordinary morning, there was tension in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on my chest, subtle at first, like a faint shadow brushing against the corner of my mind, but growing with every passing second, every glance, every unspoken word, until it became nearly unbearable, a weight that made my limbs feel sluggish and my heart beat in a rhythm I had never known before. My daughter-in-law had that look in her eyes, the one I had come to recognize over months of growing distance, a look that spoke of readiness, of assertion, of the quiet cruelty that comes when someone sees the world through a lens where boundaries are theirs alone to define. And I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, an instinctive warning that today, whatever unfolded, would not be a matter of minor disagreements or fleeting misunderstandings, but something far deeper, far more irrevocable, far more painful. And then it happened. The words struck like a hammer against glass, shattering the fragile calm that had hung between us. She told me, with a voice that was calm but cold, measured but cruel, in front of everyone gathered in the living room, the children, who had been playing moments before, the son who had tried so hard to maintain a fragile peace, that I was no longer welcome in their home, that the life I had known and believed to be secure had been quietly, irrevocably rescinded. My son remained silent, caught between loyalty and fear, his eyes flicking toward me and then away, as though the act of choosing a side had become impossible, or perhaps he had already made his choice, leaving me standing alone in the ruins of the family I had spent a lifetime nurturing. The children froze, their laughter replaced by confusion, the kind of wide-eyed uncertainty that children display when confronted with something they cannot yet comprehend, and I felt a wave of disbelief roll over me, hot and cold at the same time, as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted and I were suddenly floating in a world where all the rules I had understood no longer applied. The words, simple in their construction but heavy with consequence, echoed in the room, loud and sharp, cutting through the memories of birthdays, quiet evenings, shared meals, bedtime stories, and every moment I had invested in love and care. "You should just go. We don't need you here." In that moment, every instinct within me rose, the desire to shout, to cry, to plead, to demand that I be heard, seen, and recognized, surged up with a ferocity that made my chest ache and my vision blur. And yet, something inside me paused, some quiet, inexplicable force that told me that no words, no tears, no protestations could alter what had been decided, that the truth of their feelings had been laid bare, and that the space I had once believed was mine. Home I had considered a sanctuary had vanished like morning mist under the sun. I felt the familiar ache of heartbreak, raw and unrelenting, mingling with the shock and disbelief. And yet, even as it threatened to pull me under, a strange clarity emerged, a recognition that I had reached the end of what I could endure within that house, that the only path forward, however painful, was to rise, to gather the fragments of my dignity, and to step away from a world that no longer had room for me. And so I smiled, a small, sad, and almost imperceptible smile that contained the weight of decades of love, sacrifice, and shared life. It was not a smile of joy or relief, but of acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance that the life I had known was gone, and that I could not force it back into existence through tears or words. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the air fill my lungs as if it were infusing me with the courage to act, the resolve to embrace the unknown. And then I rose from my chair, each movement deliberate, each step a silent act of reclaiming my own strength. I walked toward the door, toward the world outside that had suddenly grown vast and unfamiliar, my heart heavy but resolute, knowing that stepping across that threshold would mark the end of an era, the closing of a chapter filled with both love and pain, and the beginning of a journey I would have to walk alone. I opened the door, the sound of the latch clicking into place reverberating in the quiet room, and as I moved through the threshold, I left behind not just a house, not just a family, but a life that had once been my anchor, a life that I had poured myself into with every ounce of devotion I possessed. I stepped outside, feeling the cool air brush against my skin, carrying with it the faint, distant laughter of children, the soft hum of a world that no longer included me in the way it once had. And in that moment, as the sunlight shifted and shadows stretched long across the ground, I understood, with a clarity that was at once devastating and oddly liberating, that I had crossed a line from which there was no return, that I had exited not just a home, but a chapter of my life. And that from this day forward, I would have to navigate a new reality where love, family, and belonging were no longer guaranteed, where the only certainty was the strength I could summon within myself to keep moving forward, one deliberate step at a time, into a future that was uncertain, solitary, and yet wholly, irrevocably my own. The driveway stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of solitude, disappearing into the distance as if inviting me to leave behind not just the house, not just the family, but every memory, every expectation, every ounce of love and devotion I had poured into decades of shared life. Each step I took felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the cumulative sorrow of years, with the invisible burden of moments lost, of laughter that had faded into strained silence, of hugs that had once been warm now replaced with polite nods and avoidance. Yet at the same time, each step felt strangely liberating, as though with every footfall I was shedding layers of doubt, fear, and unspoken resentment, reclaiming a sense of self I had long suppressed in my effort to belong, to nurture, and to love unconditionally. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I did not feel the need to explain myself, to justify the love I had given, the sacrifices I had made, or the presence I had believed was an anchor for my son, my daughter-in-law, and the children who had once clung to me as if I were a part of the very air they breathed. The act of walking away was quiet, almost sacred, as if the world itself had paused to allow me a moment to grieve, to reflect, to feel the full weight of my loss without interruption, without judgment, without the expectation to smile, to forgive, or to conform to a reality that no longer welcomed me. As I moved along the gravel driveway, the crunch beneath my shoes mingled with the echo of memories, each one a vivid, piercing reminder of the life I had loved and the life I was leaving behind. I thought of birthdays celebrated with laughter and homemade cakes, of holidays filled with warmth, the scent of cooking mingling with the sound of cheerful chatter, of quiet nights when my son would lean against my shoulder and whisper his dreams, of late-night talks where confidences were shared and hearts were mended, and of the tears I had wiped away, both theirs and my own, with hands that had known only love and tenderness. Every memory carried a twinge of ache, a reminder that the life I had invested myself in so completely could no longer hold me. And yet, amidst the sorrow, there was a curious lightness, a sense of freedom that came from no longer being bound by a home where my presence was questioned, a love that was no longer reciprocated, and a heart that had been quietly diminished by the slow erosion of respect and acceptance. I realized, with a clarity that both comforted and saddened me, that stepping away did not signify that I loved them any less. My love remained, unwavering and unbroken, but it was no longer sufficient to secure my place in a world that had quietly shifted beneath my feet. Walking away was not an act of hatred, nor of resentment, but an acknowledgement that to protect the fragile core of my own heart, I had to recognize when my presence was no longer honored, when my efforts were overlooked, when the home I had considered a sanctuary had become a place of subtle exclusion and quiet pain. And in that recognition, painful as it was, I found a strength I had never known existed within me, a quiet fortitude that whispered I could endure, that I could survive, that I could reclaim a life defined not solely by the love of others, but by the love I had for myself, for my own dignity, for my own sense of worth. With each step I took, the distance between me and the home I had cherished grew, and with it, a new perspective emerged, one that allowed me to see both the beauty and the cruelty of attachment, the fragility of human bonds, and the power of self-preservation. I remembered the countless small gestures I had made, the moments of patience, the countless nights spent comforting children or mediating between my son and his wife, the ways I had quietly held the family together when tensions flared, and I realized that though none of these efforts guaranteed the recognition I longed for, they had shaped me, strengthened me, and prepared me for this moment of departure. The air around me felt crisp, almost sacred, carrying with it the faint sense of the garden, the distant hum of life continuing without me. And in that quiet solitude, I allowed myself to grieve not only for what I had lost, but for what I had once hoped would endure forever. And yet, amidst the grief, there was a spark of hope, a quiet promise that walking away did not mean the end of my story, that beyond this driveway, beyond the familiar walls and strained smiles, there lay a world where I could rebuild, where I could redefine love, connection, and belonging on my own terms, and where I could finally honor myself as someone worthy of respect, care, and the gentle joy that comes from truly being seen. As I continued forward, I understood that freedom does not always come in loud declarations or dramatic gestures. It often arrives quietly, step by step, in the acceptance of what cannot be changed, and in the courage to leave behind what no longer serves the heart. The driveway stretched before me, long and solitary, yet with every step, I felt lighter, stronger, more aware of the life I still had to live, the love I still had to give, and the possibilities that lay ahead. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the delicate, tender stirring of hope, that maybe, just maybe, leaving behind everything I knew was not an end, but the beginning of a chapter filled with quiet resilience, rediscovery, and a freedom I had never allowed myself to feel. Until now, walking away from everything I had loved, yet not leaving the capacity to love itself behind. For that, I knew, would remain with me always, untouchable and enduring, a flame of my own making, carrying me forward into a future that, though uncertain, was wholly, undeniably my own. That evening, as I sat alone on the narrow porch of my small apartment, the world around me softened into a quiet hush, the faint hum of distant traffic, and the occasional whisper of wind, through the trees forming a gentle backdrop to the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I let the tears come, not the bitter, angry tears that rise from confrontation or frustration, but the quiet, reflective tears that seep from the deep corners of the heart, tears that spoke of acceptance, of surrender, and of a slow, deliberate acknowledgement that the life I had known, the family I had poured myself into, had shifted in ways I could not mend or reclaim. I thought about the journey that lay ahead, not merely the physical separation, the distance from the home I had loved and the people I had devoted myself to, but the far more complex and delicate journey of rebuilding my life from the fragments of love, devotion, and heartbreak that now rested heavy on my shoulders. I realized that this path would not be easy. It would require me to confront solitude, to sit with my own thoughts without the comforting distraction of others, to face the quiet questions about worth, belonging, and identity that life had suddenly thrust into the forefront. And yet, in that solitude, in the stillness of the evening, there was a strange, tender clarity, a whisper that suggested even when life takes away what we hold most dear, it also carves space for something entirely new, something fragile but beautiful, waiting for us to nurture it, to recognize it, and to allow ourselves to embrace it. I began to see the faint lights that had been overlooked in the shadows of my former life, friendships I had neglected while focusing on family, hobbies I had abandoned in the service of others, the quiet joys of books, painting, walks at dawn, and long evenings spent with my own thoughts, that all of these became small beacons, guiding me forward, each one a gentle reminder that life did not end with loss, that it simply transformed, and that I too could transform with it. I thought about mornings when I could make tea without the anticipation of judgment, evenings when I could watch the sun slip behind distant rooftops without interruption, the freedom to move through my own home, quiet and unclaimed, yet wholly mine, and I felt a subtle shift within myself, a delicate yet undeniable stirring of hope that perhaps the world, even after heartbreak, could still offer warmth, comfort, and moments of simple, untainted joy. And in that quiet, reflective stillness, I understood something essential, a truth I had not fully grasped until the echoes of rejection faded into the background and left me alone with my own heart. Leaving does not always mean losing, and distance from those we love does not negate the love we carry for them, nor does it diminish the experiences we shared. Sometimes, leaving means choosing yourself, placing your own heart, safety, and dignity above the expectations and limitations of others, honoring the quiet voice within that insists upon being recognized, respected, and protected. It means opening the possibility for love and connection to exist in new forms, to flow into corners of life previously ignored, to find warmth in friendships, in community, in the small, unnoticed joys of being fully, unapologetically oneself. I felt the weight of years lifting, slowly but surely, with every breath, with every careful step I imagined taking into this new chapter, with every moment of reflection that reminded me that my life, though altered, was not over, and that the capacity to love, to hope, to dream, and to find beauty had never truly left me. The road ahead was uncertain, winding through unknown landscapes of emotion, circumstance, and personal growth. Yet it was wholly, beautifully mine, and that ownership brought with it a gentle sense of empowerment I had never allowed myself to feel in the years spent tending to others. For the first time in what felt like decades, a comforting warmth settled into my chest, tender and reassuring, not the heat of excitement or joy, but the steady, glowing light of possibility. A promise that life, even after heartbreak, even after rejection and loss, could still hold beauty, could still offer moments of peace, laughter, and connection. And that I, having survived the unthinkable quiet of being unseen and unvalued, could now step forward into a life that was unclaimed, open, and alive with potential. In that moment, sitting alone as the twilight deepened into night, I realized that beginnings are rarely grand or loud. They are often quiet, reflective, and deeply internal, rooted in the decision to honor oneself, to nurture the fragile flame of hope, and to take the first step into a path that promises, at its heart, that even after loss, life continues, full of possibility, full of gentle light, and full of the quiet. Steadfast promise that tomorrow may yet bring beauty in forms we cannot yet imagine, if only we are willing to embrace it. The days that followed my departure from their car were drenched in a silence so thick it felt almost tangible, pressing against my chest and wrapping around me like a heavy, unyielding shroud, leaving every corner of my small apartment filled with a stillness I had never truly experienced before, a quiet that magnified each heartbeat, each intake of breath, and each flicker of thought until I felt as though I were suspended in time between what had been and what could never be again. There were no calls, no messages, no invitations to return, and at first, that absence of contact felt like a betrayal by the universe itself. A cruel echo of the rejection I had already endured, each passing hour ringing with the unspoken verdict of my absence. I was no longer wanted, no longer needed, no longer part of the world I had spent a lifetime nurturing and loving. The sting of that rejection was sharp, a cold hand pressing firmly against my heart, making each beat ache with the weight of disbelief and sorrow, and I found myself questioning everything I had done, replaying conversations, revisiting moments of tension, searching desperately for some misstep, some failure that could explain why the life I had invested myself in with such devotion had dissolved into distance and silence. Had I done something wrong? Could I have tried harder, loved more, given more patience, more attention, more understanding? Was my love, the love that had defined my life, not enough to hold them together with me, to keep the bonds I had cherished from fraying into absence and avoidance? The questions circled endlessly in my mind, each one leaving me more restless, more hollow, until I finally realized that the answers I sought were not to be found in their reactions, in their silence, or in their decisions, but somewhere within myself, in the quiet heart of my own reflection, waiting patiently for me to notice. And as the days stretched into evenings, and the evenings into nights punctuated only by the distant sounds of life moving on without me, I began to hear another voice, one that I had long ignored amid the busyness of caring for others, the responsibilities of nurturing, the ceaseless effort to maintain harmony, and the weight of selfless devotion that had characterized my every action. It was a soft, gentle voice, almost tender in its persistence, whispering not in accusation or bitterness, but in quiet encouragement. "You have always given, but when was the last time you received in return? When was the last time your needs were acknowledged, your heart tended to, your existence honored in the same way you honor theirs?" I thought of the countless moments, the countless nights spent awake worrying about their happiness, the mornings spent preparing meals to nourish both body and soul, the evenings reading stories to children who would fall asleep trusting in my presence, the hours spent mediating tensions, smoothing over conflicts, and offering comfort in ways so instinctive that I hardly recognized the energy I was giving until it was gone. And yet, here I was, standing on the other side of a door that no longer invited me in, invisible in the eyes of those I had loved most. A presence once cherished now rendered mute by choice and circumstance, a life intertwined with theirs reduced to echoes of laughter and memory, and I felt the ache of that invisibility press against my spirit with relentless weight. The silence that enveloped me was deafening, yet in its vast expanse, it began to carry a subtle clarity, like sunlight filtering through heavy clouds, revealing contours I had overlooked in the rush of devotion, the urgency of caretaking, and the constant act of giving. I realized with a quiet, almost startling certainty that I did not need to be wanted by everyone to have worth, that the validation I had long sought in their smiles, their acknowledgement, and their presence was not the measure of my life, nor the determinant of my value. In this absence, in this quiet void that once felt like punishment, I discovered a space to reconnect with myself, to hear my own thoughts, desires, and needs without the overlay of expectation, without the constant weighing of others' approval. It became a place where reflection was possible, a sanctuary where I could sit with the memories of love freely given without judgment, where I could acknowledge my pain, grieve my losses, and yet also recognize the resilience that had carried me this far, the depth of heart that had sustained not only them, but me through years of effort and care. Slowly, the silence transformed from something oppressive into something instructive, a teacher showing me that life is not defined solely by the recognition of others, that self-worth is not contingent upon being needed, that love is not diminished when it is unreciprocated, and that the act of simply existing, of honoring one's own heart, of tending to the self, is in itself an achievement of courage and grace. I began to listen more closely to the small stirrings of hope and possibility that had always been present, whispering faintly beneath the pain, suggesting that life could continue, that joy could be found even in solitude, and that connection, though perhaps different from what I had once imagined, was still possible. I thought of friends I had neglected, of hobbies that had been set aside in service to family, of the quiet pleasure of a morning cup of tea, of the satisfaction of arranging a small bouquet of flowers on the table, of books whose pages had patiently waited for my return, of walks in the evening where the air carried the faint scent of blooming jasmine, the distant hum of life continuing, alive, vibrant, and indifferent to the heartache I felt, yet quietly offering me space to reclaim my own rhythm. In that stillness, I found clarity, an understanding that the emptiness around me was not punishment but opportunity, that the silence could teach me patience, reflection, and a renewed sense of self, that I could, for the first time in many years, hear my own voice clearly, without the overlay of worry, guilt, or the constant giving that had characterized my life for so long. And in that reflective quiet, I made a choice. A silent, gentle, irrevocable choice to honor myself, to nurture the fragile flame of self-respect that had flickered but never died despite the years of devotion, and to begin rebuilding a life defined not by the approval of others, but by the depth of my own love, the strength of my own heart, and the recognition that even when life removes what we treasure most, it often leaves behind the possibility for renewal, for growth, for connection in forms we could never have imagined while clinging to the familiar. The silence between us, once deafening and suffocating, had become a mirror, reflecting both the pain and the promise of existence, showing me that I could survive, that I could heal, and that I could, at last, hear myself again, fully, deeply, and without compromise, standing on the threshold of a life reclaimed from the shadows of absence, a life where my worth was no longer defined by others, and my heart, once diminished by rejection, could begin to beat freely, unburdened, and strong once more. There was a day, quiet and gray, when I sat down at my small, worn desk, the kind of desk that had borne the weight of countless letters, bills, and notes over the years, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming need to write, a need to pour every feeling, every hurt, every longing, every fragment of my heart onto paper, as though by capturing it in ink, I could somehow make sense of the swirl of emotion inside me, as though the act of writing could translate the invisible weight of sorrow, loss, and love into something tangible, something the world could hold, if only for a moment. I wrote slowly at first, choosing words with care, each sentence a deliberate attempt to bridge the gap between my experience and theirs, to express a lifetime of devotion that had gone unnoticed, unacknowledged, or perhaps misunderstood. I wrote about the dinners I had cooked with love, carefully arranging the food, thinking of the smiles that would follow, the warmth I hoped to nurture, the laughter that would fill the kitchen as plates were passed and stories were shared. I wrote about the nights I had stayed awake, worrying for my son, my daughter-in-law, the children, my mind restless as I imagined their troubles, their fears, and their happiness, wondering if I had done enough, given enough, loved enough to ensure their lives felt secure and bright. I wrote about the sacrifices I had made, those quiet, unseen acts of devotion, the skipped rest, the postponed desires, the moments I set aside my own needs to ensure theirs were met, the tiny pieces of my own life I had relinquished to keep the family whole, and how, despite all this, I had found myself now standing outside, invisible, overlooked, and unexpectedly alone in a world that once embraced me. And then, as the words continued to flow, as I traced the lines of my memories, my regrets, my love, a strange realization settled over me like a soft, unrelenting fog. Sending this letter, no matter how heartfelt or honest, would change nothing. The words, no matter how raw or vulnerable, could not force anyone to feel the depth of what I had felt, could not make them understand the quiet desperation behind each act of care, the countless small gestures that had gone unnoticed, the weight of my presence that had once been a source of comfort, now rendered irrelevant by distance, by silence, by choice. No letter, I realized, could undo the pain that had been carved into the spaces between us. No message could bridge the gulf that had grown quietly but decisively, separating us into worlds that no longer overlapped, no matter how much I longed for the familiarity of love returned. I hesitated, pen trembling in my hand, the paper filled with my truth, my heart laid bare in ink, and I felt the pull of desire to reach out, to let them know, to demand recognition, to plead for understanding. But somewhere deep within me, a quiet voice whispered that closure, true closure, cannot be forced from others, that sometimes the act of expressing, of nomming, of articulating our truth for ourselves, is the most profound form of resolution we can achieve. I folded the paper carefully, each crease deliberate, precise, as though the very act of folding could help me contain the swelling tide of emotion, the ache that threatened to spill over and drown me in memory and longing. I placed it in an envelope, the paper resting inside like a fragile, delicate artifact of my heart, and I left it there on my desk, a silent testament to both my pain and my courage. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I would glance at the envelope, and the impulse to send it would rise like a wave, insistent and tempting, tugging at the edges of my resolve. Yet every time I resisted, because I understood that sending it would not guarantee understanding, reconciliation, or return. It might simply dissolve into the void of indifference, and my vulnerability, laid bare, could be met not with empathy but with silence once more. In leaving it unsent, I found a strange, quiet power, a sense of agency that had been missing for so long, a recognition that my truth, once expressed, no longer required validation from anyone else, that the act of writing itself, the courage to name my pain, my love, my hope, was enough to honor the depth of my experience and to preserve the dignity of my heart. Through that unsent letter, I began to understand something essential, something that had eluded me in the frantic effort to preserve love in its previous form. Closure does not always come from the people we wish it would, nor from apologies, reconciliations, or the restoration of what was lost. Sometimes, closure is an inward journey, a quiet acceptance that the past cannot be rewritten, that hearts do not always align, that love, no matter how genuine, cannot always command reciprocity, and that peace comes not from forcing change but from embracing truth, honoring one's own feelings, and recognizing that the act of existing, of feeling, and of acknowledging one's own worth is a profound form of resolution in itself. The letter, resting on my desk, became a symbol, not of failure, nor of unreciprocated love, but of courage, of honesty, of the decision to honor my own heart in a world that had not always done the same. And in that quiet, reflective act, I felt a slow, subtle release, a sense that even amidst heartbreak, even in the absence of the love I had long hoped for, I could still assert my existence, validate my own experience, and find peace within the contours of my own soul, knowing that my truth, once written, was eternal, unshakable, and wholly mine, carrying with it the quiet promise that life, though changed, could still be lived with dignity, resilience, and an unwavering capacity to love. The first few months after stepping away from their lives were the heaviest I had ever known, days stretching endlessly in a haze of confusion, sorrow, and uncertainty, as though the world itself had shifted beneath my feet, leaving me untethered and grasping for a place I could call my own, wondering if everything I had cherished, everything I had invested my heart and soul into, had vanished completely, leaving only echoes of laughter and fragments of memories that were beautiful yet unbearably painful. The mornings felt cold and hollow, the sunlight weak as it spilled through the windows of my small apartment, casting long, unfamiliar shadows that seemed to stretch across every corner, filling them with the sense of absence and loss, a quiet reminder that the family I had nurtured and loved was now a world I could no longer inhabit. And for a while, I struggled to find meaning, to understand how a life so full of connection could collapse into such silence and solitude. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like the gentle seep of light across a landscape after a storm, I began to rebuild, to reclaim fragments of myself that had been buried beneath years of devotion, under the weight of responsibilities, under the invisible expectation that my life was defined solely by the happiness and approval of others. I started by reconnecting with friends I had neglected, those quiet, patient souls who had always been there, waiting for me on the sidelines, offering smiles, gentle encouragement, and companionship that was unwavering, unconditional, and free of expectation. And with each visit, each shared cup of tea, each quiet conversation, I felt the fragile threads of belonging and trust weaving themselves back into the tapestry of my life, stitching together spaces I had thought permanently empty. I took up hobbies that had once brought me joy, but had been abandoned in service to family, small acts that reminded me of who I was outside the identity of mother, grandmother, caretaker. The simple pleasure of dipping a brush into paint and watching colors come alive on a blank canvas, The immersion in the pages of a novel where words and stories carried me into distant worlds. The slow, steady rhythm of walking through the park at dawn, feeling the cool breeze on my face. Listening to the soft rustle of leaves, the distant chirping of birds heralding the start of a day untouched by sorrow. All of it forming a quiet, healing rhythm that slowly restored a sense of control, purpose, and self-worth. Each of these small acts became a step forward, a reclamation of life, a demonstration that happiness and fulfillment were not tethered solely to the family I had lost, but were things I could nurture within myself, independent, resilient, and enduring. And in this rebuilding, I began to understand a profound truth: that I could still love them, the children, my son, the family I had once known, without requiring their love in return, that the memories of laughter, warmth, and shared joy could live in my heart without allowing the pain of rejection to define the entirety of my existence. And so, my world, once narrowed and confined by sorrow, began to expand again, gradually, like a flower unfurling its petals in the slow light of spring. Tentative yet determined, delicate yet steadfast, embracing the beauty and possibilities that had always existed around me but had been obscured by grief and loss. I discovered that even in the quietest moments, when the weight of absence pressed heavily upon me, when evenings were spent sitting in silence, tears tracing paths down my cheeks as I longed for the presence I had lost, I was growing stronger, learning to cradle both grief and hope in my heart simultaneously, recognizing that sadness and resilience, loss and the promise of new beginnings, could coexist without diminishing one another. Each emotion a thread in the complex tapestry of life that allowed me to move forward without erasing the past. I felt my heart expand to hold the pain of what had been, while also nurturing the tender shoots of what could be, the quiet joys of independence, of self-discovery, of connections rebuilt and new ones forming, the subtle satisfaction of moments that were entirely my own, unclaimed, and alive with possibility. In rebuilding my world, I learned patience, acceptance, and the power of gentle persistence, the understanding that growth is rarely sudden, that healing is often imperceptible at first, like the slow rise of the tide, imperceptible until the shore is transformed, reshaped, renewed. I cherished the little victories: a morning when I laughed freely without thought of judgment, a quiet meal enjoyed without distraction or expectation, the feeling of a book in my hands that transported me beyond my grief, the gentle encouragement of friends whose presence reminded me that love still existed in forms untainted by rejection, that life itself could be a source of comfort and beauty if I allowed myself to receive it. And gradually, I felt a sense of ownership over my own life that I had not known for decades, a quiet empowerment that whispered to me with each passing day: "You are enough, you are whole, your heart is resilient, and your capacity to love and to find joy is limitless, unbound by circumstance, unshaken by absence, and entirely yours to nurture." Though some nights remained heavy with longing, when the ache of missing them seemed to stretch across every corner of my apartment, when the echo of voices I had loved still rang in my ears, I no longer felt paralyzed by the weight of absence. Instead, I allowed the grief to coexist with hope, sorrow with possibility, recognizing that this duality was the essence of living fully after loss. Each day became a testament to endurance, each small act of joy a reaffirmation that my heart could expand to hold both memory and present, both grief and growth, both the ache of what was lost and the quiet anticipation of what life still had to offer. I began to see beauty in the ordinary: the first rays of sunlight spilling across the floor, the laughter of a friend over a shared memory, the scent of fresh bread baking in the oven, the gentle rustle of autumn leaves in the wind, the satisfaction of a painting completed, the slow unfolding of a story that captured my imagination. Each of these moments became a brick in the foundation of a world rebuilt, a world that belonged to me, that could hold love in its many forms, that allowed me to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, and that offered the promise that life, though changed, could still be rich, meaningful, and deeply, tenderly beautiful. Years have passed since that day I stepped out of the car, the moment still etched into my memory with a clarity that surprises me sometimes. A moment when the world shifted beneath my feet, and the life I had known, the life I had poured myself into, was irreversibly altered. Yet in that alteration, in that breaking of what I thought was permanent, a new path quietly revealed itself, one that demanded I carry my heart carefully, tenderly, without allowing the wounds of rejection to dictate the contours of my existence or define the boundaries of my love. For I had learned, slowly and painstakingly, that love does not always follow the trajectory we hope for, that the people we cherish may not always meet us halfway, and that letting go, while excruciating in its early stages, does not mean erasing memory, does not mean erasing affection, but instead requires a deep, patient acceptance of reality as it is. A recognition that the heart is resilient, capable of holding both sorrow and hope, grief and gratitude, the ache of loss alongside the quiet bloom of possibility. I have found peace in the quiet, unassuming moments of my own life, in the spaces that were once filled with expectation and obligation, but are now open to the rhythm of my own choosing. And in these spaces, I have discovered that happiness is often simple, understated, and tender. The warmth of a cup of tea held in my hands as morning sunlight spills across the table, the slow unfolding of a book whose words carry me away into another world, the gentle hush of evening when the wind rustles through the trees and the distant hum of life moves on outside my window. All these small, quiet pleasures teaching me that life, though altered, is still rich, and that contentment often resides not in grand gestures, but in the deliberate noticing of the ordinary, the everyday. The soft beauty that surrounds us, and we allow ourselves to pause and breathe fully. I have found joy in the laughter of friends who choose to stay, who have become my companions not because of obligation or history, but because of genuine care, because they see me fully, with the complexities of my heart intact. And in that laughter, in those shared moments, I have realized that connection, love, and companionship can be rebuilt, nurtured, and experienced anew, often in ways that feel more authentic, more reciprocal, and more sustaining than what I had once assumed was the only form of family. And with that, I have found hope, fragile but unwavering, a quiet light that does not demand immediate recognition or guarantee, but simply persists, suggesting that life can still offer kindness, warmth, and love in ways that surprise us, that arrive in unexpected forms and from unforeseen sources, and that even after heartbreak, the heart is capable of renewal, capable of opening again, capable of embracing life fully without fear, without regret, without clinging desperately to what has passed. Sometimes I think of my son, my daughter-in-law, and the children I raised, and I feel the tug of memory, the lingering warmth of the love that once bound us together. But I do not wish them ill, nor do I resent them for their choices, nor do I regret the devotion I gave so freely, so fully, for it was genuine, and it was mine to give. Instead, I carry only a quiet wish that they, too, find happiness in their lives, that they encounter understanding, compassion, and perhaps, someday a recognition of the bond that once existed, even if it cannot be restored to the shape I had imagined. And I hope that in some small way, the love I offered continues to ripple through their lives, unseen, but enduring, like a soft echo of the care and patience that defined my heart for them. And as for me, I step forward each day with a heart that has weathered both heartbreak and healing, that has learned the depth of sorrow, the quiet ache of rejection, and the delicate, persistent resilience of hope. I step forward with a calm strength that has been forged in the fires of loss, tempered by reflection, and nurtured by the small, tender joys that now constitute the rhythm of my life, carrying with me the understanding that leaving was not an end, not a closing of the story, but rather the beginning of a life that is wholly, unapologetically, and beautifully my own, a life where I am free to love without expectation, to care without obligation, and to walk forward into each day with the gentle, steadfast knowledge that peace is possible, that joy can be reclaimed, that hope is not fragile but resilient, and that even after the deepest heartbreak, the heart can still open fully to the world, to connection, and to the quiet, luminous promise of life itself.